Good day. Today is Friday, 23rd January 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel if, having watched this video or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, the last couple of days have been days of intense activity. I'm not sure whether they can be described exactly as diplomatic activity. But anyway, there's been intense activity in Davos, in all sorts of places. Last night, there was a meeting in Moscow, in the Kremlin, between Putin and various American officials, Witkoff, Kushner, and the latest attendee of these meetings, Josh Grönbaum, who is apparently concerned mostly with the setting up of the Board of Peace. I'll come to all of that shortly. But before I discuss some of that, I'm going to return to a topic that I just touched on in yesterday's program, which is the speech that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, though perhaps it ought to be said that the Russians consider him the illegal, unconstitutional president of Ukraine, but let's put that aside. Anyway, that Zelensky made at Davos. When I made my program yesterday, I was aware that Zelensky had made an rather angry speech, but I hadn't watched the speech in its entirety. Well, I now have, and I think angry is perhaps an understatement. My overall impression was that Zelensky again was furious, and that he, as he actually quite often does, had no intention of concealing the fact from everybody in the room at which he was speaking. And it's not difficult to understand why. He had declined an invitation to come to Davos. He'd originally agreed to come to Davos, but then he said he wouldn't come to Davos. He said he would remain in Kiev. He said that the energy crisis in Ukraine was far too important a matter for him to leave behind him and to go to Davos. I've said that in the past, this would certainly not have been the kind of reason that Zelensky would have given for not coming to a place like Davos. He's never let small matters like an energy crisis in Kiev or a collapse of the situation in the front lines prevent him from traveling abroad, and especially to Europe, and meeting his friends there. In fact, he does this constantly and all the time. He was recently in Cyprus, for example, trying to drum up support for sanctions and other things, which, to be frank, given that Cyprus is a rather small place, it did beg the question of why he was there. Anyway, so it didn't seem to me likely that Zelensky was not going to go to Davos because of the matter of the energy crisis in Kiev, very serious though that is. Rather, as he eventually said himself, he saw no purpose in going to Davos unless he came back with something concrete in the form of a written and signed document to show. And it's not difficult to work out what those documents are. Firstly, some kind of security guarantee document from the United States. Zelensky has been trying to get the Americans to give Ukraine some kind of security guarantee ever since Donald Trump was elected. The meeting in the Oval Office in February of last year, which went so badly wrong, was because Zelensky was furious when he realized that the Americans were pressing forward with a mineral rights extraction deal, but were not prepared to give in return Ukraine a security guarantee. And the meeting went badly wrong from that moment. So he was hoping, it seems to me again, that the Americans would provide Ukraine with a security guarantee. He's been talking about this a great deal. He's been claiming that a document is almost ready or largely ready. All that it needs is a signature. This is, of course, a document that the Russians have never agreed to, and which has not been discussed as part of any final agreement in any negotiations with the Russians. But as we know, especially since the Alaska meeting, Zelensky has been relentlessly pushing again the idea of a security guarantee from the United States. The Europeans have been supporting him in this, and Donald Trump, who back in February seemed very unwilling to agree to provide Ukraine with any kind of security guarantee, after Alaska wobbled, and there have been various discussions about security guarantees between Ukraine and the United States, though it's fair to say that up to now, nothing actually has materialized. So that is one of the documents that Zelensky was no doubt looking for. The other, perhaps one that he had more hopes or expectations of receiving, was an $800 billion reconstruction package. This would have been based in part, as I understand it, on the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets. But others, there would have been contributors from other places. And again, from Zelensky's point of view, this is an important, in fact, in some ways, an even more important document than the security guarantee document that he could have brought back with him to Kiev. And here one needs to understand the situation in Ukraine at the present time. Firstly, as we all know, there is a massive energy crisis across Ukraine. Many of the cities are in blackouts. Secondly, the situation on the front lines is bad and is getting worse, as I will discuss later in this program. Over the last 48 hours, it appears to have become much worse. But for Zelensky, always the priority is to maintain his grip on the political situation in Kiev itself. And in order for that to happen, he needs to persuade people in Kiev, the various stakeholders within the Ukrainian political class, that the flow of funds from the United States, from Europe, from wherever, from the West, is going to continue to come. And of course, funding from the United States began to dry up last year. It's never stopped completely, but it's not at the level that it used to be during the time of the Biden administration. And, well, the funding from Europe has dried up mostly as well. Back in December, there was an epic battle within the European Union to provide Zelensky with, I think it was a 140 billion euro loan. That was already a reduction from an earlier amount of 200 billion euros that had apparently been floating around previously. Anyway, there was an epic battle to provide that loan, with European governments practically without exception facing an acute budgetary crisis. It would have been very difficult to go and to float the possibility of such a loan to European parliaments, coming and asking European parliaments to provide money on that scale to Ukraine is becoming increasingly difficult politically. And one gets the sense that in Italy, for example, probably the support to do that is no longer there. And I suspect that even in Germany, it's becoming harder. So the Europeans came up with the idea of anchoring this loan on the Russian frozen assets and raising the bonds on the international financial markets to provide this loan, but the Russian frozen assets would provide the security which would persuade the bondholders to buy the bonds. Well, that ran into a wall of opposition. Lawyers and legal people and all sorts of people said that this was an incredibly unwise and reckless thing to do, that there was no legal basis to do this, that the money in the financial reserves was Russian, and that this was an obvious misappropriation of these assets to float this loan. And eventually, after intense opposition from Belgium, joined ultimately by Italy and France, that plan had to be abandoned. And then instead, there was the substitute plan, 90 billion euro loan, significantly scaled down loan, not anchored on Russian frozen assets, raised jointly by the European Union, or at least raised by the European Commission by floating bonds, but completely uncertain how exactly that loan would be repaid, how the bondholders would be repaid. Talk about the Russians providing reparation at some unknown future time. Talk about the European governments providing some kind of backstop, but no real explanation of what that backstop would be. I said back in December that I wasn't sure how this loan was going to work. And so far, as of now, as of the time of making of this program, it seems that there's been no step taken to place these bonds on the international financial markets. And in fact, there's also been a big row within the European Union about what this money should be used for anyway, and whether Ukraine can use part of this money, the greater part of this money, to buy weapons from the United States, or whether it must buy all its weapons from Europe, which of course is actually impossible. Macron has proposed the latter, and I wonder whether he did this in part in order to sabotage this loan, which he must know is problematic, to put it mildly. So at this moment in time, there is no guaranteed money flow to Ukraine. Ukraine has a budgetary crisis. The situation in the budget will have become much more acute, much more severe since December, since the discussions in December, because the energy crisis in Ukraine will have caused massive damage to what remains of the Ukrainian economy. That means that whatever tax revenue Ukraine has been receiving will have further dwindled. The Russians have been tightening a blockade on the port of Odessa, so export revenue will have fallen as well. hardly anybody talks about this, but the budgetary crisis in Ukraine has sharpened since December, and Ukraine currently has no absolutely guaranteed flow of funding from the West on the kind of scale it needs to get it through to the summer, let alone to cover it for the 2 years that some people in the West, in relation to this 90 billion euro loan, are talking about. So from Zelensky's point of view, coming to Davos and then returning to Kiev with a signed document pledging $800 billion for the reconstruction of Ukraine would have been actually something quite important. It would have enabled Zelensky to tell the stakeholders, the political and other stakeholders in Ukraine, well, don't worry, things may be tough now, but money is going to start to flow. And who knows, it might even have been the case that the Ukrainians might have been able to use a pledge from the United States to provide $800 billion in the future as some kind of security to raise loans, all kinds of loans in all sorts of places, perhaps to enable this 90 billion euro loan to start crystallizing, to try to get some kind of money flowing to Ukraine now. So Zelensky said that he would not go to Davos unless he got those things. And then what happened was that Donald Trump, over the course of his own address to Davos, to the people at Davos, said that he intended to meet Zelensky the following day. In other words, he summoned Zelensky to Davos. And reading between the lines of Zelensky's speech, it's fairly clear to me that the Europeans then went on the phones, started to work the phones. Ted told Zelensky, you must come to Davos. Trump wants to meet you. He will take it very, very badly if you don't come. Don't talk about Tomahawk missile supplies to Ukraine or anything like that. Zelensky, over the course of his speech, confirmed that the Europeans specifically told him not to bring up the topic of Tomahawk missiles with Trump when he met Trump, so as not to upset Trump. So, very reluctantly, very unhappily, Zelensky came. And he met with Trump, and the meeting seems to have lasted less than an hour. Trump thought it was an excellent meeting, though he's not explained why. Zelensky obviously thought otherwise, because not only did he come with no signed agreements promising future security guarantees, and absolutely not a signed document over the $800 billion reconstruction fund. But apparently, over the course of the meeting with Trump was evasive about both questions. And Zelensky left the meeting clearly in a furious mood, and he went to the conference chamber and he made an absolutely astonishing speech. I have read reports that have referred to it as a rant, others as a tirade, others talking about Zelensky being in a rage. Well, perhaps these are rather strong words, but certainly he did come across to me as very, very angry indeed. and he basically went for the Americans. He basically, well, he made it crystal clear, at least to me, that he wasn't happy with the Americans, even if he criticized them more by implication than expressly. He's obviously very nervous of repeating the row in the Oval Office, which he had with Trump back in February of last year. But in respect of his European allies and friends, well, he made no secret of what he thinks of them. He called them spineless, weak. Well, not quite those words, but essentially those words. He said that they had none of the strength that the Americans had. He ridiculed their position on Greenland. And here, by the way, he was implicitly criticizing the Americans, because in effect he was saying that the Americans should not really have been involved in Greenland. And he seems to be at the same time saying that the Europeans had no ability to push back against the Americans on Greenland. He ridiculed the Europeans' minuscule deployment to Greenland, quite understandably. He was furious that the Europeans have failed up to now to stop Russian oil exports. He contrasted the American ability to seize tankers with the European inability to seize tankers. One person who took that to heart appears to have been President Macron of France. He immediately rushed to seize a tanker sailing under a Cameroonian flag in the Mediterranean. He didn't say that this was a Russian tanker. He said this was a tanker that was sailing from Russia. Again, completely uncertain whose oil it was carrying. I'll come to all of that later in this program. But anyway, Zelensky went on and on. And as I said, he made his anger at the weakness and inability of his European allies to give him what he wanted, as far as I could see, entirely clear. He came up with all sorts of grandiose claims about Ukraine's ability to go on fighting. He contrasted the strength of Ukraine's army with the feebleness of Europe. He gave fantastic claims again about the level of losses that the Russians are suffering. Media Zona, I notice, has started to publish the names of the Russian soldiers who it says have been killed in the war and whose deaths it has identified from open sources. But for the record, their overall figure at the moment is 160,000, and that is far below. That doesn't remotely match Zelensky's claims, just to say. And anyway, Zelensky also again spoke about the Russian economy being almost exhausted, being tired. Again, rather an extraordinary statement to make from someone whose economy is now essentially falling apart with the cities in blackout. But, well, and of course he also criticized Orban. He essentially called for a regime change operation against Iran. He criticized the Europeans for doing nothing to achieve that regime change. You could say that you could make the same point about Trump, by the way, but he didn't really say that. Also, at least he criticized the Europeans for taking no action over the course of the Christmas New Year holiday. Anyway, it was an extraordinary speech. It was Zelenskyy's equivalent of the tantrum he made against the Americans in February last year. It's the same kind of tantrum all over again, but this time it was directed at his European friends. And the contrast here with the Americans is astonishing. The Americans threw him out of the White House and told him to get lost. The Europeans gave him a standing ovation. The behavior of the European leaders over the last 2-3 weeks has been a spectacle of degradation that is absolutely incredible to me. As a European, as somebody who knows European history, seeing the leaders of formerly great nations stand up and applaud Zelensky in this way after what he has said about them is truly astonishing. I don't know how far, how low Europe can go, but based on what happened in Davos, based even more on this speech than what happened over the Greenland affair, Europe is sinking fast. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Zelensky, well, Orban said that he's sounding hopeless and desperate, and to be frank, I agree. Now, Zelensky did also announce that there was going to be a trilateral meeting of Ukraine, Russia, and the United States in Abu Dhabi, starting today. And he leaked that before the Americans and the Russians did. And that now brings me to the other big meeting that took place last night, lasted 3.5 hours, which is shorter than usual. And that was the meeting between Putin, Witkoff, Kushner, and Grönbaum, though Ushakov and Kirill Dmitriev were also present at this meeting. It happened very late at night in Moscow. Putin had already, by the way, by that time, a full day. He chaired, in particular, a meeting, as I understand it, on development of Russia's microelectronics industry. A very interesting topic, by the way, which I might discuss some other time. But anyway, Putin nonetheless found the energy to meet with Witkoff and Kushner. Now, I said in my previous program that I thought that the most likely reason for this meeting was for Putin to at last learn from the Americans what all of the discussions that the Americans have been having with the Europeans and the Ukrainians over the last couple of weeks have been all about. And Ushakov, who, as normally happens, provides us with an update, an explanation, an account of these meetings between Putin and the Americans, and did so early this morning. And, by the way, a reasonably coherent and easier to understand account from Ushakov it has been than some of the earlier ones. Anyway, basically, he said exactly that. He said that that was exactly what this meeting ultimately was about. His words, Ushakov's words, as reported by the Kremlin, are these. As you know, our counterparts arrived from Davos after taking part in a series of events together with President Trump, including those concerning the Ukraine settlement. These meetings literally lasted until it was time for them to leave for Moscow. They offered what can be called their first-hand accounts of these events and shared their impressions as well as their latest thoughts and assessments regarding the meeting between President Trump and Zelensky in Davos. Both Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner were present at that meeting. They also offered their perspective on other contacts they had in December and January in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, and in several European capitals, which obviously, by the way, includes that all but disastrous meeting that took place in Paris on the 6th and 7th of January. Anyway, to continue. Overall, I can say that the focus of the meeting between the President of Russia and US representatives was to obtain information resulting from the contacts the United States had with the Europeans and the Ukrainians in order to define further steps between our countries. In summary, the Russians are aware that there have been all of these discussions, all of these endless meetings with Witkoff and Kushner and the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and between Trump and Zelensky and sometimes the Europeans over the last few weeks since Witkoff and Kushner last came to Moscow and met with Putin on the 3rd of December. The Russians must be utterly bewildered and confused by all of these discussions and all of these proposals and all of these plans that have been circulating. And the Russians obviously need to know what has been going on. I discussed in my program yesterday how there must be concerns. Certainly I have those concerns, but I'm sure that the Russians have concerns that the Russians are being told one thing by the Americans about the American plans, and the Americans are telling a completely different set of things to the Ukrainians and perhaps to the Europeans. And the Russians will want to know whether or not that is the case. And anyway, they will want to get a sense, a handle about these discussions. And that was probably what took up the most of the time over the course of the meeting between Putin and the Americans last night. And Ushakov basically tells us this. I can say that the focus of the meeting was to obtain information resulting from the contacts the United States had with the Ukrainians and the Europeans. So it was basically Putin trying to work out what has been going on over the last 6 weeks since Witkoff and Kushner came with the 28, or was it the 27 points, to Moscow. And, well, we could say that the meeting, this part of the meeting, was perhaps not entirely smooth going. Ushakov says the talks went on for approximately 4 hours. Actually, I understand it closer to 3.5 hours. And they were exceptionally in-depth, constructive, and I should say constituted an extremely frank and heart-to-heart conversation. Now, my very good friend Larry Johnson, with whose overall assessment of the meeting, by the way, I should say I agree, feels that this perhaps amounted to something, well, perhaps not quite a row, but in places a difficult meeting. The key phrase is constructive and extremely frank. I think these are words that come ultimately from the Russian media. As I said, to repeat again, Ushakov's actual words, as reported by the Kremlin, this is their own translation, were extremely frank and heart-to-heart. But anyway, Larry Johnson says that this implies a heated exchange of views and some very tough talk. I wouldn't go that far. I'm not sure that heated is exactly the word that I would use to describe all of this. No doubt there was very tough talk, but I think perhaps the word I would use is searching. In other words, Putin would have been particularly probing in his questions. He is a lawyer, a fact which people always forget. He's a master of detail. He has conducted negotiations at length many times. He's aware of all the nuances, as he once described them, and all of the difficult questions. I am sure he asked very difficult questions of the Americans and followed them up rather forcefully. But as I said, I'm not sure it was exactly a heated meeting. But that would have been the main point of this discussion. Putin trying to get a sense of what the Americans have actually been telling and agreeing with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans, and whether they have in fact agreed anything. And here we get to perhaps the most surprising part of Ushakov's account, because much of the media, in fact the media overall, refers to this meeting between Putin and the Americans as a negotiation. But there is actually no word, as far as I can see, in Ushakov's description of the meeting, that anything was negotiated at all. There is no reference to any American plans, be it 27-point plans, 20-point plans, 14-point plans, 19-point plans. There's no actual discussion here, as there was after the meeting on the 3rd of December of the Americans and the Russians, of Putin, Witkoff and Kushner, going through American proposals point by point. It doesn't seem, as far as I could see, that there was any discussion at all. Putin wanted to find out what the Americans had been talking about with the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And given how complex and bizarre this whole set of discussions has been, probably that took up far and away the greater time of this meeting. The one thing that we could say definitely is that Putin made it again absolutely clear that there is not going to be any sort of ceasefire or cessation of the conflict, and that he continues to insist at the minimum on the Americans and on the Americans following through on whatever it was that Putin and Trump discussed in Anchorage. And these are the words that Ushakov gives. The participants in the conversation between Putin and the Americans reaffirmed the fact that bringing about a lasting settlement would be unlikely without addressing the territorial issue based on the formula as agreed in Anchorage. Vladimir Putin has emphasized Russia's sincere commitment to settling the Ukrainian crisis by political and diplomatic means. But as long as this is not the case, Russia will persist in its consistent efforts to achieve the special military operations goals on the battlefield where Russian armed forces hold the strategic initiative. So it's Anchorage or nothing. If you are really seriously thinking about coming to an agreement, you have to go back to what we discussed in Anchorage. And in the meantime, we are continuing with the special military operation. All of these various proposals, plans, ideas that have been floating around, which basically depart from Anchorage, are simply not going to work. Now, Ushakov refers specifically to the territorial issue. This is because the Americans accept that the Ukrainians up to now have been immovable on the territorial issue. But notice again the very careful words that Ushakov uses. The participants in the conversation reaffirmed the fact that bringing about a lasting settlement would be unlikely without addressing the territorial issue based on the formula as agreed in Anchorage. So participants doesn't just mean Putin, it means the Americans as well. So the Americans accepted that the Ukrainians have made no concessions on the territorial issue, that they've not been able to get forward. They've not even been able to reach first base, in other words, never mind discuss anything else. And the Americans acknowledged, because the Americans are participants in this meeting, as well as the Russians, the Americans acknowledge that without the Ukrainians doing that, there really isn't any prospect or any realistic prospect of reaching any kind of lasting agreement. So, for the moment at least, we're stuck. And I'm going to add something else to my interpretation of Ushakov's words. When we read that Putin says that as long as there is no settlement, diplomatic settlement, Russia will persist in its consistent efforts to achieve the special military operations goals on the battlefield. When Putin says that to the Americans, when we're told by Ushakov that Putin said that to the Americans, that reads to me as the Americans again coming to Moscow and proposing some kind of ceasefire. And in fact, we have a certain number of reports about this, and they've been floating around in the media. And the reports are about the Americans suggesting some kind of energy truce, the Russians ending attacks on the Ukrainian energy system, which is, as we know now, close to collapse, and the Ukrainians in return stopping attacks on Russian refineries and energy facilities and tankers. And of course, as I've discussed in many programs, the Russians, from their point of view, they're being asked in these ceasefire proposals to agree to stop attacks on a Ukrainian energy system, which is bringing Ukraine close to the point of collapse, in return for an ending of Ukrainian attacks on their energy system, which are no more than pinpricks. I've looked at some of the numbers, by the way, and as far as I can see, oil refining capacity in Russia has been barely dented. There is no shortage of refined fuels on the Russian energy market. The Russians continue to export refined fuels, though always their major export is crude oil. And as for crude oil production, over the course of 2025, it fell by 0.8% overall, which is almost certainly accounted for more by economic factors than by sanctions or anything else, and certainly not by these Ukrainian attacks. So the Russians would see this as an extremely bad trade from their point of view. And anyway, Putin straightforwardly rejected it. He said, look, I've said it many times, I'm going to say it again, we don't trust the Ukrainians an inch. We are not going to agree to any kind of ceasefire. Whenever we've tried ceasefires, as we briefly did in terms of attacks on energy facilities in the spring, it hasn't worked. We don't trust the Ukrainians, and we're not going to agree to any kind of ceasefire, including attacks on energy systems, where we have the Ukrainians on the floor until and unless a proper peace agreement, a peace settlement is reached. So it seems to me that Putin simply, if there was a ceasefire proposal, which I suspect, by the way, there was, a mutual cessation of attacks on energy facilities, Putin, at least at this meeting, rejected it. So that's, if you like, the more substantive parts of the meeting. Now, there is another topic that has attracted a great deal of attention, and that brings us back to the setting up of this trilateral working group on security issues in Abu Dhabi. And this is what Ushakov had to say about that. An agreement on the next step in this direction has been reached. There was an agreement to hold the first meeting of a trilateral working group on security matters as soon as today, this Friday, January 23rd, in Abu Dhabi, with Russia, the US and Ukraine. Abu Dhabi will also serve as a venue for a meeting of the heads of a bilateral working group on economic matters. This is a bilateral group formed by Russia and the United States. Their respective heads are Dmitriev and Witkoff. By the way, nobody's talking about this other working group, but finally, after almost a year of discussions, the Americans and the Russians are setting up an actual bilateral working group, a direct negotiation between the United States and Russia, headed by, respectively, Dmitriev and Witkoff, to discuss economic and trade questions between their two countries. But anyway, let's return to the trilateral security working group that's going to be meeting today in Abu Dhabi. We have already formed our negotiating team on security matters, so clearly this happened before the meeting, so this has clearly been under discussion for some time, and it will be on its way to the Emirates in a matter of hours. The group includes senior officials from the Defence Ministry, led by the Chief of the Main Directorate of the General Staff, Admiral Kostyukov. Now, let me anticipate by saying that Admiral Kostyukov is a former spy and the head of Russia's Military Directorate of Intelligence. In other words, he's a spy chief. He is the head of the organization that in the West continues to be called the GRU. Now, Peskov has provided us with a little bit more information about the people on the Russian side who will be making up the Russian side of the delegation to this working group. These are the military. These are officials of the Defense Ministry. We will not name them yet. It's all military personnel. This is a working group on security issues. These will be the first negotiations. That's what Peskov said to reporters this morning. So it's going to be made up entirely of military officials, headed by one of Russia's leading spy masters. Now, here I'm just going to say something about Kostyukov. Kostyukov has a title of vice admiral. His rank within the Russian military is vice admiral, and it is absolutely true that he has a naval background. He trained as a naval officer, and presumably that also included some service on ships. But if you go to the internet, you will find almost nothing at all about his military career, except the fact that he trained at some point, presumably in the 1980s, in Russia's Military Diplomatic Academy. Now, the Military Diplomatic Academy trains, officially, it trains military attaches. But military attaches based in embassies around the world of all the leading powers, as is universally known, are deeply involved in intelligence. And I've found through a certain amount of research that Kostyukov was at one point the Russian military attaché at the Russian embassy in Greece, in Athens. Now, Athens, for those who don't know, is very, very much a centre of international spying activities. I mean, there are lots of spies who work there. This is where a lot of the intelligence agencies of the Middle East operate, and of course the Russians are busy, and the Americans are also busy, and the British and others are busy too. So Kostyukov was right apparently at the centre of all of this, and as far as I'm concerned, this identifies him as a spy. You will find on the internet remarkably little information about Kostyukov, barely anything about his early career before he was appointed to head the GRU. So that strongly suggests to me that whatever career he had in ships was relatively brief, and we are therefore looking at somebody whose entire career in Russia almost certainly has been in intelligence. And he's heading a delegation going to Abu Dhabi, made up of military people, but Peskov won't give us their names. Now, I have to say, to me, this looks like a delegation made up mostly of spies, people from GRU, perhaps from the FSB and the SVR, but those sort of people. And, well, the head of the intelligence, or rather of the Ukrainian delegation going to this meeting in Abu Dhabi is apparently going to be Budanov, who was, of course, until recently Ukraine's military intelligence chief. In other words, Kostyukov's opposite number. And we know, because the US Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, gate-crashed the meeting, that Budanov also has a history of meeting with Russian intelligence officers. And he did so back in, I think it was November, in Abu Dhabi. His chief interlocutor in that meeting was an official from the FSB. And as I said, we know about that particular meeting only because Dan Driscoll, to Russian annoyance, gate-crashed in on it. So, to me, this looks like mostly a meeting of intelligence people. And I don't know anything yet about who's going to participate in the American side of the meeting. But again, it's a reasonable guess that it will be again intelligence or intelligence-connected people. And yes, the Ukrainian delegation does have civilian officials too. Umerov and Arachamia. Umerov, the former defense minister and Ukraine's chief negotiator, and Arachamia, who is the head of Zelenskyy's party in the Ukrainian parliament. But I wonder whether their job isn't ultimately is more to keep an eye on Budanov, who is someone who I strongly suspect, in fact, I'm absolutely sure, Zelensky doesn't fully trust. So what are all of these people going to be talking about in Abu Dhabi? Well, it seems that the Americans it was the Americans who proposed the setting up of this trilateral working party. And we are told, again by Ushakov, that they've given a lot of time thinking about this meeting, and they've been working hard to try to set up this meeting and to do something constructive with it. And I'm going to suggest that really what this is all about is that it's an American attempt to get past all of the damage that was done following the drone attack on Valdai, on Putin's Valdai residence. Now, I said in my program yesterday that I'd received an email from someone who has actually very good sources in Russia, that Putin was absolutely furious about that meeting. And I said that in the aftermath of that meeting, the Russians said that they were going to, well, at least it seemed to me that the Russians were saying, Putin was saying, and Ushakov was saying that they would harden their positions in advance of future negotiations. And I suspect, by the way, that is still the case. There's no hint from Ushakov's words that the Russians have retreated on any point. The Germans today are again saying that the Russians are sticking to maximalist positions, and they probably by now been briefed about what happened at this meeting in Moscow. So, and as I said, there's been no substantive negotiations for this meeting up to now anyway. But I wonder, and this is obviously, again, a guess, it's speculation, but as I say, consider who is participating in this meeting on the Russian side. I wonder whether this isn't an attempt by the Americans to get past what happened in Valdai, to set up this working group of spies and intelligence officials and people of that kind, have them meet in Abu Dhabi and try to work out arrangements to ensure that things like the drone attack on Valdai never happen again, or at least to reassure the Russians that the Americans are going to try to prevent that happening again. Whether the Russians are entirely convinced, I'm far from sure. I've already discussed that very disturbing article that Seymour Hersh published a couple of days ago, which seemed to me to be all but saying that people in the US intelligence community were looking for some way to remove Putin from the scene, and some way to remove Putin from the scene could extend, perhaps does extend, to assassination. I'm not going to repeat what I said about that article again, but I doubt that those people, assuming that they exist, will have changed their minds. But anyway, the Americans, perhaps realizing how angry the Russians were about this attack, might be trying to tell the Russians, look, we understand that this is a terrible thing, a horrible mistake. We promise you this will never happen again. Let's set up this working party to sort these things out with each other and to make sure that things like this never happen again. Well, where does this working party take us, and will it lead further to a full settlement of the conflict in Ukraine? There's an article in the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera which says that there are 4 parts now to the discussions. One of these involves security guarantees. Another part involves $800 billion reconstruction fund for Ukraine and all of that sort of thing. That article in Corriere della Sera, I strongly suspect, represents what the Ukrainians would like to see come out of this meeting. But I have to say that, to me, the makeup of the Russian delegation, the fact that it is headed by a spy and a spy master, suggests to me that this working party, it has a much more restricted function, and it's probably mostly intended, or at least it's been proposed by the Americans, basically to soothe or lull the Russians after the Valdai attack, and perhaps it's intended to create mechanisms to make sure that nothing like that happens again. That's much more how it looks to me. Now, whether the Russians are going to be lulled, how seriously they take this working party, well, that is a completely different matter. I suspect that they're not going to be lulled at all. We're talking about a country with an enormous and extremely sophisticated intelligence community indeed. But no doubt the Russians will see what it is that the Americans come up with, and they will take it from there. Now, I will just finish by saying that in any discussion in which the Americans and the Russians are present, and there is a third party, in this case Ukraine, almost inevitably it is going to evolve into a discussion between the Americans and the Russians. That is what happened in the Paris talks between the North Vietnamese and the Americans. The South Vietnamese were there, but after a certain point, they were sidelined because the Americans and the North Vietnamese needed to talk to each other. The same thing happened over the course of the talks in Doha between the Americans and the Taliban. The pro-American Afghan government was also supposed to be participating in the talks, but ultimately it was sidelined as well. So it will be the Americans and the Russians who will be leading these discussions in Abu Dhabi. And as I said, we will see where ultimately they go. And it will be the Americans and the Russians who will be setting up parameters in future involving who drone attacks can be used against. The Russians will want the Americans to get the Ukrainians to stop attacking places like hotel buildings in Kherson and that sort of thing. Anyway, we will see what comes of it. I would add that if the Oreshnik attack on Lvov did indeed strike at a command center in Lvov, and did indeed kill Westerners, Western intelligence people, and there are some claims that it did, putting aside whether it was in a bunker or in an above ground facility. That might have been another factor in causing these discussions, the Americans to propose the setting up of this working party. So anyway, we will see what comes out of this meeting in Abu Dhabi. My own guess is that it will be discussions of a technical nature, if discussions about limiting drone attacks on presidents and hotels and reducing perhaps the pace of assassination attempts and planting bombs under bridges and derailing trains and all of that kind of thing can be described as being matters of a technical nature. Those are the things, as I said, that I think the Russians will want to discuss. Anyway, I think it will be more about that, important though that is, trying to put a lid, in effect, on the dirty war before it spirals out of control, then about talking about the larger issues of a diplomatic settlement in Ukraine. Anyway, that's my take of this meeting. That's what Ushakov said on the Ukrainian part, on the part of the meeting that related to the conflict in Ukraine. Putin wanted to know what the Americans have been talking about with the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and the Americans anxious to put a lid on the dirty war following the events in Valdai and perhaps the Oreshnik strike in Lvov, before that spirals out of control, especially given the angry reaction from the Russians to the Valdai attack. Now, let's make a further point about this meeting, because it lasted, as I said, for 3.5 hours, and probably the greater part of the meeting was taken up by Ukrainian-related matters, but it wasn't the only part, because this other person, Josh Grunbaum, was at this meeting also. And he's all about getting the board of peace set up. And Putin mischievously proposed that, yes, he might be willing to join this board of peace. And as for the $1 billion entry fee, well, the way to pay that would be out of the $5 billion of Russian frozen assets. Frozen not in Europe, but in the United States. And somewhat to my astonishment, Trump agreed. So Trump has agreed to that. And apparently there was a lot of discussion between Grunbaum and the Russians and Putin about the way forward. And Putin, over the course of a meeting he had with the Security Council, the Russian Security Council, the previous day, also floated the possibility that, well, if there is a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, the Russians would not be opposed to using the remaining $4 billion to try to finance part of the reconstruction of the damage done in the war. Though I noticed that the Russians are now making it clear that that includes funding, that this Russian money will be used also, in fact, perhaps used primarily to repair the damage done in places like Donbass, which obviously the Russians expect to be transferred back, or rather considered to be part of their own country. So the Russians will be spending much, perhaps most of their money repairing the damage within what they see as their own country to rebuild their country itself. Just to say, well, the Americans, again, don't seem to be opposed to this. It's important to stress, by the way, that when Putin has been talking about using the money, the frozen assets for this kind of reconstruction, he's only talking about the assets which have been frozen in the United States. And the key thing is that it will be the Russians who will have discretion to decide how this money is used, though that will all be set out in whatever final settlement to this conflict is ever agreed. The European assets, the Russian assets in Europe, which are much greater, they are not covered in any way by this proposal from Putin. Now, I think that the reason the Russians are doing this is because they're building up a case, their legal case, against the Europeans, and proposing that they use the money in this way to pay their entry fee into the Board of Peace and to fund their own reconstruction efforts in Donbass and elsewhere, partly no doubt in Ukraine too, is their way again of saying this is our money and we spend it the way we choose. And this, of course, has legal implications, because if the Americans agree to this, which apparently they have done, then the Americans are again in effect saying that this is Russian money, and it is Russian money to decide how it should be spent and what it can be used for. And of course, what is true of Russian assets frozen in the United States, the Russians are going to argue, is equally true of Russian assets frozen in Europe. These maneuvers have strengthened the case that the Russians are currently bringing against the Europeans in relation to the frozen assets in Europe. And in fact, yesterday, a Russian official again reiterated that the Russian assets in Europe belong to Russia, and it is for the Russians to decide what must be done with them. Getting the Americans on side with this argument, which is what this is all about, is going to strengthen the Russian case. Not decisively, but significantly, and bear in mind that it is already a very strong case. Well, all of this is going on. In the meantime, the war itself continues. There's been another massive series of Russian attacks. Schmigel is saying that the situation is the worst since November 2022. It is far worse than it was in November 2022. I remember that time well, but the energy situation across Ukraine, the blackouts across Ukraine are much worse than they were then. Klitschko is again renewing his advice to people in Kiev to leave Kiev if they can. And last night, the Russians pounded Zelenskyy's hometown of Kryvyi Rog, major industrial center, between Zaporozhye and Odessa on the west bank of the Dnieper. If the Russians do cross the Dnieper and advance towards Odessa, as all the indications are suggesting that they will, then Kryvyi Rog must be a potential target. I've already said that to me, these massive attacks by the Russians look to me to be a softening up exercise in advance of a big Russian offensive that is coming. And it does seem to me as if the Russians definitely now have Odessa in their sights. Anyway, the Russians, after the capture of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and other places and also their successful capture of Gulyapolye, have been reorganizing. In Zaporozhye region, they also have to sort out their logistics, and those logistics mean establishing logistics that cross a river, to be precise, the Gaitshur River, so they have to set up pontoon bridges and other bridges. But it does seem as if the Russians are back in motion again, that they're advancing once more west of the Gaitshur River. The Ukrainians have confirmed that a village called Zelenskiy is now, which is an important village, is under significant pressure from the Russians. The various mapping projects suggest that the Russians have now revived their advance, their attack on the town of Novopavlovka in Dnipropetrovsk region. This battle has been going on for a very, very long time. The Russians seemed to put it on hold for several weeks, but it looks as if it's now been renewed, and the Russians do look as if they've restarted it in a very big way. But perhaps the more dramatic news is that the Russians are now pushing forward aggressively north of Pokrovsk. They are definitely now, it seems to me, clearing Grishino. And they've taken significant positions north of Pokrovsk and are close to capturing Belitska, a small town north of Rodinska, and they are close to encircling Belitska. I noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry is now talking about active operations by Group of Forces Center, active offensive operations by Group of Forces Center. So I think for the first time ever in this war, the Russian Defense Ministry, in one of its bulletins, has actually used the word offensive to describe the actions of the Russian army. And there's been reports from Ukrainian sources which suggest that the situation in Konstantinovka for the Ukrainians is becoming very bad. The Russians control all the high ground around Konstantinovka. The most important piece of high ground, by the way, is the town of Chasov Yar. They can see pretty much everything that the Ukrainians are doing in Konstantinovka. They control the high ground to the south and west as well. Their artillery is positioned all around Konstantinovka. It turns out, something I didn't know, that there is a small river that bisects Konstantinovka is in southern portions. It seems, according to some reports, that Ukrainian logistics in southern Konstantinovka are collapsing. And the Russians have also destroyed a bridge, a road bridge, to the north of Konstantinovka, through which supplies have to cross by road to reach Konstantinovka from the north. So, without overstating things, because to repeat again, I am not there. The commander, the Russian commander, who is in charge of the fighting around Konstantinovka, sort of told Putin that he expected Konstantinovka to fall under Russian control in early February, and perhaps we are moving closer and closer to that point, and perhaps that rather optimistic deadline might even be reached, just saying. And there's also apparently been a major intensification of Russian operations in the Liman area, and the mapping projects are now showing significant parts of Liman under Russian control, and the Russians seem to be advancing to the west of Liman in ways that suggest that they're also aiming to cut the supply lines into Liman as well. Possibly, Liman might also fall to the Russians fairly soon. Winter, the heavy snows, the need to reorganize after the advances that took place in December probably explain why the Russians have been moving more slowly in the first weeks of January. But it does look as if the pace of advance is accelerating again, and I remain with the view that Konstantinovka and all of these other places, Liman as well, probably will fall well before the end of the winter, and we will see the siege of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk begin then. No ceasefire, no sign that the Russians are moderating their positions. Indeed, we could quite soon find out that they have significantly hardened them, as I still believe. And as for this meeting between Putin and Witkoff and Kushner yesterday, to repeat again, no reason to think that any negotiations took place. It doesn't look as if it was that kind of a meeting, and we will see where we go. We will see what happens also. I suspect a lot will depend on whether this trilateral working party in Abu Dhabi, which is really, as I said, a meeting between the Americans and the Russians, mostly, will indeed succeed in bringing the dirty war to an end, and probably only then will the Russians decide whether this process has anywhere to go. In the meantime, the Russians, despite Macron's latest stunt of capturing a ship which was flying under a Cameroonian flag and might not even be Russian-owned. Anyway, we will see. Anyway, the Russians have taken the further steps to signal the protection of their ships. Another Russian tanker flying the Russian flag, passed through the channel, the English Channel, and it did so with a military escort. There was a Russian warship accompanying it. And the British, for all their strong words of recent days, weeks, did not interfere. The Russians will protect ships that fly the Russian flag. They're telling tankers that carry oil from Russia to re-register in Russia and to start flying the Russian flag. The Russians will protect ships that fly their own flag. They won't protect, they have no legal grounds to protect ships that fly the flag of other countries. So a ship that flies a Cameroonian flag, they will not protect. A ship that is part of the Russian merchant marine, they will protect. They are also very angry that despite Trump's agreement to release the two Russian sailors who the Americans captured on the Marinera, the tanker that was captured off the coast of Scotland that hasn't yet happened, and the Russian Foreign Ministry has publicly complained about it and has demanded their release. And I'm sure that Putin repeated that demand when he met with Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow. So this has been a long program discussing all of these various things. We will see where this process goes. The working party in Abu Dhabi is interesting, but substantive negotiations haven't taken place. Putin now has been told by the Americans what they have discussed with Zelensky and with the Europeans. Zelensky is very angry because he hasn't been given with anything by the Americans of substance up to now. I think the Russians will wait to see how the working party works before deciding what further steps they're going to take. And in the meantime, they're going to press on, as Putin clearly said over the course of the meeting, with the war. There's much more that can be said about the events of the last week. I've had a number of people asking my views about a speech that Michael Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, made in Davos. I think this speech has received more attention than it actually deserves. That's my own view, but I will turn to that in future programs. The other thing, of course, that is important is that it does look as if American military assets are gathering around Iran. The USS Abraham Lincoln is now there. American fighter jets are positioned around Iran. I suspect that a strike against Iran is back on the table, back on the agenda. But again, I will have to discuss that in future programs. This is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X, and Substack. Please remember, if you want to support our work, that you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Also, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. And last but not least, let me wish you a very good day, and I will be back soon.